Hello, 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 everyone. It's felt like forever. So we usually do live streams every Wednesday, Natasha, and because of the conference and so it's felt like way, way, way too long. So I miss everybody. So what I want to start with before we jump into Natasha, who's our amazing guest today, and going over the main things, I just want to say a huge thank you. Natasha, you've been to the conferences before, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we just got back from the annual conference, and it's one of those things on the back end. Like, it's a lot of work. Rachel, who's with the foundation, is on the back end too, and she knows how much work it is. She puts in a lot of work, and so does the foundation. But we're always in these meetings. We're planning amazing guests like you, and you never know if anybody's watching it. Like, you get the numbers, but numbers don't always really mean anything. But it was amazing. I mean, like, such an honor being at the conference this past weekend, just getting stopped by so many people. It was like new clinicians that are like, I'm just getting into OCD treatment and I watched the live streams with you and Liz. Or it was parents and family members who are like, I watched the live streams and I got my kids to watch it, and that's why they went to treatment. Or had people with OCD coming up and saying, I watch your live streams, I don't miss them, I always get a tidbit of information. And it's like, it's crazy because you don't, you hope people are watching it and liking it, not like, why, not just my mom who's like, he's amazing, but you always hope. But I mean, it was bombardment and it was such an honor. And I tried to say hi and take pictures with everybody, but it was so sweet. So if you're watching this and I met you at the conference, I just want to say thank you. I am so glad you came up to me. Please always approach me. I just was so honored just to hear the stories of how much these live streams mean to you. A lot of people don't know, Natasha, that these kind of really came out of the pandemic. There were so many people contacting the foundation and saying, I'm alone and my OCD is horrible and I can't find a clinician. So Ethan Smith was like, we got to do something for the community. So that's kind of where these came from. So I'm so glad they have been here to stay. People were so sweet up at the conference. And if I didn't see you at the conference, I don't only mean the people at the conference, anybody that watches this and tunes in and interacts or just watches and listens, or watches it on the replay on youtube.com/IOCDF. We are super honored to have you. Real quick thing about the conference. So what is, for you, Natasha, we just got out off of the conference. How do you handle the conference blues? Because I have them hardcore right now. Do an activity. How do you kind of bounce back afterwards?
A lot of times I'm just exhausted. And so, I think mine is probably different because I'm exhausted and I'm like overstimulated. And so like, I have to like not plan anything for about 4 days to just regroup. I'm an introvert. I
was gonna say, that's why it's perfect. So for everybody, the agenda today is we're going to talk about social anxiety or social phobia, as it can be known as well. So social anxiety disorder. And then we'll be answering questions. They can be about social anxiety. They can be about OCD. They can be about anything. But it is true. I mean, that's the conversations that we have. Like I remember learning as a clinician, people that are introvert, I think there's such extreme visions of introverts and extroverts. Like, introverts are at home all day reading a book under their covers, and extroverts are dancing on bar tops and like screaming and stuff. And it isn't always like that. Like, introverts and extroverts can go to the conference, but for me, at being an extrovert, like leaving the conference, I'm like, it needs to be another week. I miss everybody. I wish it was longer. And all my, all the clinicians and people I know that are either introverted or have social anxiety disorder or body dysmorphic disorder or OCD, and it was like a push just to be there. And this isn't only a conference; it can be to leave your house in general. Yeah. Obviously it's like once you're kind of out of that environment, it's like a cool down period. So
yeah, definitely some planning, like, have your hotel room, go back to your hotel room, regroup. Yeah.
And I was out till 3 a.m. in the market talking to everybody, and yeah.
We're like yin and yang.
Yes, very much.
The opposite of me. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I just want to say real quick before we jump into this live stream, if you weren't able to come to the conference, it just happened in Orlando. We'll be back next year around mid-July, I believe it is, in Chicago. It has a great virtual component. I think that's what was so neat. So I run a support group and for adults on Tuesday evenings, and we had the support group last night, and two of my attendees saw the virtual conference. They really liked the talk on perfectionism. There was like a bunch of different talks, but one of the things that they said is that the like tech was amazing. They said that it was like clear, no lagging and stuff. So I go to the website. I don't know if you can sign up and still watch the virtual recorded sessions, or if you had to have already signed up. But for next year, if you can't make it to Chicago, there is a virtual component. And so you'll be able to watch the presentations, including the keynote. It was Danielle Pearson. If you're not familiar with her, look her up. She is a self-made millionaire. She has a really successful business. She's very young, but she talked about having to navigate OCD along with along with ADHD and depression to really kind of build her business. And I think hearing it as somebody with OCD and depression, I really related. So if you came to the conference, we welcomed you. I'm so glad you came. If you went virtual, great. If you couldn't make it to either, we totally understand. And that's why we keep these live streams always at no cost so that we can provide resources. So always remember, real quick, just a reminder that these live streams are for education, community, connection. They're not to replace therapy. So if you are in a state of crisis, please go to a local emergency room, dial 911 if you're in the US, or call 988 or go to 988lifeline.org. And then these are being recorded on multiple social media platforms. You can always go to youtube.com/IOCDF to share this live stream with people you think would enjoy it. But I am so excited to be with my guest, Natasha Daniels, who I've admired her work from afar and have sent a lot. She does a lot of work for parents around how to support and love an anxious child. And I had always sent her materials to parents that I started working with young children. But it was actually at a OCD Game Changers event that we got to hang out and have Greek food, and I got to meet your kids and get to know you better. And I was like texting Michelle Massey. I'm like, oh my God, Natasha's amazing. And she's like, I know. But anyways, so glad to have you. Why don't you before we jump in, tell people a little bit about what you do and how they can find you and sort of your story.
Yeah. So I am an anxiety and OCD child therapist, and I provide global resources for parents who are raising kids with anxiety or OCD. So I have a podcast, a YouTube channel, courses, and a community where we do like live weekly calls and support group calls. I have 3 of my own kids with anxiety and OCD, so it's a real passion for me. And today, talking about social anxiety, I've just started to be more, been really acute, and I actually have a memoir coming out in September.
Because as long as I've been doing the live streams, I don't think we've ever done an episode. And I will say, it is very high co-occurring with OCD. A lot of my clients come in with social anxiety. So for the basics, I always like to start the basics and not assume people really know. Walk through what consists. What I always like to do with our guests first is, I'm very passionate about treating body dysmorphic disorder. And I hear people saying, I have body dysmorphia all the time. Social anxiety, there's so many people here. But it's really different when it becomes a disorder. So can you kind of walk us through, like, what does it mean to have the diagnosis of social anxiety?
Yeah, I'm glad you start with that, because I do feel like people don't understand social anxiety. Sometimes they'll think it means you're shy or you're an introvert. And really, you could be an introvert and be really solid and not have any kind of social anxiety. Social anxiety is about the fear of judgment, criticism, isolation, rejection. It's really about feeling like you're not enough, and that's what I think makes social anxiety.
Yeah, and what I always like to remind people, can you talk about the disorder component? So I think that's so important. So I always tell people, in body dysmorphia, you don't have disorder, because disorder is very important. So when we talk, how can somebody know that maybe what they're experiencing is a disorder and they should seek some help?
Yeah, it's the acuity of it, because a lot of people, because when I start talking about my own social anxiety or start talking to parents about social anxiety, they'll say, well, don't we all feel like, we don't want rejection, or don't we all feel a little uncomfortable when we get into a crowd? Or it is the acuity of it. It's like the inability to really function. So a lot of avoidance, not doing certain things that are very triggering, the ruminating of being stuck constantly, analyzing and reanalyzing what has happened, what happened in the past, what is going to happen. So similar to OCD, you're really stuck in your brain and in your mind, and you have this skewed perception of reality. And I think the difference with social anxiety is that a lot of times you don't even realize that you have social anxiety. You feel like people just don't like you. And so there's often not this awareness for a while that it is a disorder.
Yeah, and the reason I always like to remind people disorder is because what disorder means is basically like it is impacting your social life, your school life, your work life. It's causing experience anxious moments, like standalone moments, like very, peppered throughout their life, and it sort of links up with events that I would say that, hey, maybe 75% of being a disorder means that person is really, really having some distress about it. It is impacting them wanting to go to school because they're struggling to sit with other kids and talk to kids or present in front of class. For adults, it may mean that they completely choose a job that prevents them from having to interact with people. If they say yes to a wedding, they're spending the whole couple days before planning how they're going to say things and what they're going to say. And then after the wedding, they're thinking and running through different conversations they had. They're feeling really burnt out. Why did I do that? Why did I say that? So I always, maybe the next question would be, when should somebody say, hey, I think it's time for me to get some help?
Yeah, I think it's always time to get help when you're feeling it's needed. So I feel like it doesn't even have to be an objective thing. It could be a subjective thing of like, this is overwhelming me. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I want that extra support, because there's always someone who's out there to support you. But if it's impeding your ability to function, you're not being able to do some critical things for your life, like go to school or go to work or hang out with your friends or even make friends, or you're feeling really isolated, you're feeling depressed because of your social anxiety, then it's definitely time to seek some help.
And who would somebody seek out? So let's say somebody has gotten to a point that they are saying, hey, I really am struggling. This isn't working for me. I'm having a hard time. What kind of therapy should they look for? Who should they talk to first? Like, what would be some beginner steps that would be good?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think with social anxiety, with OCD, it's like critical you find the right type of modality and therapy, because you can go off the rank. If you have comorbid conditions like OCD, I think a therapist that specializes in this, but I think cognitive behavioral therapy is really helping your thinking. I think is, to me, at the core of getting yourself out there, but without the C part of it, the cognitive restructuring.
I really like CBT, and I think for me, what I always like to really work with a client, I like to see how, what is their head space? What is their head? A lot of times people with social anxiety are sort of built with others, especially in social experiencing that we don't feature, and the teacher's like, oh, everybody seems to love Sarah. I don't know, taking yourself out of the game or being in public, or they're avoiding a lot of cognitive side. What are some of the common belief systems that people have experienced, that you're writing about it, as you're writing?
Yeah, social anxiety is so diverse depending on the person. So that's what I do. Like, what's the narrative that you're telling yourself? And it normally is, I'm not enough of something. I mean, really, that's where I start with. And a lot of times, when are you not doing those things? And where do you not feel enough? And it's funny because social anxiety runs in my family. So all three of my kids have social anxiety, but you would never know it because one is, well, you met her. She's crazy outgoing. She's embarrassing, actually.
No, it's fun.
She is embarrassing to me, but she is fun. She's an extrovert, but she has social anxiety. Then you met my son, who's totally introvert, classic social anxiety, head on the table, like not engaging. And my older daughter, who's 20, has social anxiety, but we all worry about different things. Our stories are different. So our core fears are different. And so starting with, do you feel like you're not enough are you not smart enough? Are you not good looking enough? Are you not witty enough? Are you not, I don't know, anything enough? And that's different for each person. And so we start with that, what's the story that you're telling yourself? And normally you've got a few stories. I know for me, like my story growing up was, I'm not cool enough. I'm not smart enough. Looks weren't really, I was like, whatever, I don't look, whatever. So learning what's driving your social anxiety first is the first step, because that's the narrative that we're going to want to target. That's the struggle.
Yeah, and what I usually hear from what I like to do is uncover those kind of like core belief systems that people build, because like they start sort of off as like thoughts, but over time they really become a belief system. So then, like you said, you're not approaching a group of people to hang out with because you're like, oh, I'm not cool enough. Or, people will say, oh, I'm going to let, if we're in a group project, I'm gonna let her present more because I'm not good at articulating my words. I stumble on my words and people think I'm embarrassing or think that I'm not, clear with my words. What I like to do with clients a lot of times is like, how did we build that story up, right? Because when we start to look at the ways that people come up with those stories, it's such an internal experience. It's like they're sort of sitting there judging themselves as they interact with the words or the world. And it's like, if one person makes a comment, or we, scanning people's faces and like, oh, she didn't smile when I said this. So talk about like, if somebody has social anxiety in a stressful situation, what are some of the thoughts that are racing, and what are some of the behaviors that they're doing that kind of contribute to this belief system that something might be wrong?
And you're bringing up a good point, because I feel like social anxiety is like a heat-seeking missile. It will find evidence to support its story. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes very real and you believe that story. You're hyper-focused on that story. And so you're like, people don't want to sit next to me. Look at all these people who are not sitting next to me. No one's asking to sit next to me. No one's coming near me. Oh, she walked by me and then she moved away. The story. And I think part of it, and this is part of the struggle, is the perception is partly real. Like you're so aware, you're acutely aware that you are picking up on subtle rejections and a subtle, disinterest when someone's talking to you. Like I can pick up what's going on in a room through the lens of my social anxiety. And I think that's the hard part when I talk to people with social anxiety. They'll say, but it's true. Like that, I think that's the biggest barrier, is it's true. And I think the goal is to accept, even if it is true, it's the back door into social anxiety. Even if they didn't want to sit with you, does it matter? And that's kind of like the entrance into social anxiety that's more palatable, because when you try to target the thought, the core fear, like me. And so it's to even jump over that and be like, even if they don't, let's just start with that. Can you survive? Do you even want someone like that if they don't care about you? So I think it's such a tricky disorder.
Well, one thing, and I don't know if you see this when in your own experience with social anxiety or when working with clients, but the problem is because they hold these beliefs, their behaviors come across in a way that sort of are self-fulfilling prophecies. So often if individuals don't know that person has social anxiety, they can seem cold, they can seem disinterested. That's not what the person is. In fact, they're sitting in their heads like, I wish I could be, more calm and engaging, but they're kind of shutting down. And to an outside person, that seems like disinterested, pushing people away, etc. And then that self-fulfilling prophecy happens because they're like, oh, she doesn't seem interested, or I tried to talk to her and she didn't really engage, or I invited her to something and she said no. So talk a little bit about that. Like when somebody's really giving into social anxiety, what is the messaging that other people get? And how does it sort of almost back up that belief system that person holds?
Yeah, such a good question. because you develop these unhealthy coping mechanisms from a young age, depending on when you got it. And so you learn to not make eye contact, or you learn to find that seat in the back so that, nobody has a choice whether they can reject you or not. And I don't even think you become aware of it. I know for myself, even now, I'm still trying to learn, what am I doing that is pushing people away? Because it's definitely something external where we're so in our head and we're thinking so much and we don't want the rejection. So we do all these coping mechanisms like get out our phone or avoid it completely or sit far away. And what it looks like to other people's perspective is, I don't want to bother them, or they look like they don't want to talk. And to learn how to put your phone down and sit with that discomfort, it's like, it's sheer torture because you're just like, now I have nothing to do. But that's like the first step, because you're like, I'm obviously giving off a vibe. It's funny, I was talking to Chrissy Hodges, or when we were talking about OCD Game Changers, and she said she was trying to get me to go on OCD Game Changers, and I was like, oh, I can't do it. And she's like, you're so elusive, people want to know. And I thought, what an interesting, I really got stuck on that for a while. So I have social anxiety. I was like, I'm not elusive. That's what I'm giving off. That I'm untouchable, or I'm like hidden, or and I think that's classic social anxiety, that people give you a label or perceive you as something because you're using some unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Yeah, one of the things I see with clients is, like, as they're starting to work on it and put themselves out there and get better, a lot of times, on probably more on the female side, like what other girls will say to my client, they'll say, oh, I thought you were snobby or cold or the B word because we would try to engage with you and you were always just so pushy. And my client's like, oh my God, it's the opposite. Like, I looked up to you. I wanted to hang out with you, your group, but I was just coming up with all the ways that I would mess it up, so it's like, that's that. Or like for guys, or just people in general, they'll end up putting themselves out there, and people will be like, oh, I thought you had a different friend group and just didn't want to hang out. Or if they're an adult, it's like, oh, I thought you were just like so focused on your work, and then you left because you had a family or you had places to go, and you never went and ate out with us, or at lunch you were always in your cubicle because we just thought you were always working on projects. Meanwhile, it was just seemed busy, so nobody would ask them to do things. So I think people don't realize that they may be judged, but they're not being judged in the way they assume. There's just a lot of people that are like, I don't get it. Why does this person just want to have no interaction with other people around them?
And the funny thing is, they're dying to have interaction. I think sometimes even people think, oh, they're socially anxious, I'm not going to bother them because I don't want to make them anxious. And inside, that person who's sitting alone in the cubicle at work is dying for someone to come up to them and say, hey, do you want to go out to lunch with us? And so it's just this misreading of the cues that really kind of perpetuates the struggle.
Let's talk a little bit about, like, what are some behavioral changes, exposures that people can make. So if somebody is, dealing with social anxiety disorder, and they're really creating sort of an avoidant lifestyle, and, like you were saying, like they might go somewhere and be on their phone all the time to seem, busy so people won't bother them. What are some, I know we don't have a client in front of us, but just in general, like, what are some of the things that people can start to do different, and how do they cope during that process? Because anxiety will pop up.
Yeah. I think the first step is to make a list of what are your top 10 worst places to be or situations to be in, because that's your list right there. And it's different for each person. My list is going to be different than my client's list. And so what are the hardest things? Is it being in a party? Is it walking down the street? Is it going out to lunch with friends? Like, there are situations. And if you ask anyone with social anxiety, they'll be able to tell you, like, this would be my top 10 for sure. And then what are your safety behaviors? When you get into that crowd or you get into that situation, what are your go-to safety behaviors? So are you pulling out your phone? Are you sitting in that far seat so no one can sit near you? What are those for you? And then I think you have to do the work before you get into the exposure. And that is, what are the stories I'm telling myself? And what are the stories I'm going to tell myself when I'm in that situation? And so accepting worst case scenario at presentation and no one talks to me, no one sits next to me. What can I say to myself, versus the story that's automatically going to happen, which is nobody likes me and I can't stand it. And so then doing that hierarchy, And so putting yourself, let's say going to, I'm trying to think of something that's like going to a party. Let's say you're, going to go to a party and it's going to be uncomfortable. And maybe you bring one person as a safety behavior, because that's a safety behavior too. I couldn't ever go anywhere if I didn't have someone going with me. And then having a plan of what am I going to do? How long am I going to stay there? And I'm going to purposely not put my phone, I'm going to keep my phone in my pocket. That's super hard. And that might just be an exposure in and of itself, to like not have my phone, in my hand, and to stand there and see who comes up to me. And then you might even say, I'm going to say hi to one person I don't know. Talks to me. It's a nightmare. It feels really uncomfortable. It's a win because I did something really uncomfortable and I was able to tolerate it. I went home. I think sometimes we think a win is, and then everybody came up to me and said you were able to do a hard thing.
Example, like when I work with clients, going to that worst case scenario, met new friends, like nobody seems interested. Those 10 places, like, just will come back and they'll say, well, I get to class a second before the bell rings so that I don't have to interact with anyone. I sit in the very back and I go on my phone during breaks and I don't engage with people. And I was like, okay, what is the messaging you're sending to everybody around you? And it's like, I'm untouchable, leave me alone, etc. And I'm like, okay, if you do want to make friends in your college class, what would look different? And they're like, okay, well, I'd show up maybe 5-10 minutes early. I'm not a person that gets there like first, but a little bit early, and I'd sit kind of in the middle and I wouldn't have my phone. And let's say somebody likes the same sports team as me because they're wearing a logo, I might start a conversation. And that's what kind of the exposure looks like. And what I love that you just said is it's not always going to be a movie tail ending. They're not going to show up and everyone's going to say, now that you have your phone down, hang out with us, be our leader, right? Like sometimes people still may not talk to them, but I always tell people, the treatment isn't like Amazon 2-day delivery. There has to be some consistent give to see results. How about Natasha?
Hi, y'all. I'm so sorry. I'm running so late today, but didn't want to miss. So I was like, should I hop on or not? And then I was like, no, I want to join.
No, I'm glad you came on. We were just talking about like some of the behavioral techniques, like, when treating social anxiety disorder. What I was about to ask you, Natasha, is you talked really well about kind of dealing with the hard emotions, dealing with the sensations. What are, you talked at the beginning about like cognitive restructuring and some of the cognitive techniques in social anxiety disorder. What are some things people can be doing cognitively if they are in like that situation I just gave at college and really struggling?
Yeah, because social anxiety will swoop in and will highlight, why are you doing this? This was so stupid. Now you look dumb. You got here early and you're not touching your phone. So that narrative like that will just automatically start playing. And I think being cognizant of that and not allowing that track to play continually, and just be like, hey, you know what, everyone else, and normalizing it. And I plan those things ahead of time. Like, what are the other thoughts that you can have that feel authentic and real as well? I look at other people. Other people are sitting here without their phone and they're not talking either. Because I think we're so hyper focused on ourselves that we don't look at what the norm is. He's sitting there alone. Some of those, the narrative that you're spoon feeding yourself can be really helpful. I think you don't want to lie to yourself and be like, I'm killing it and people are going to love me, and I'm going to be really social, because it will fall for a person, but I'm opening up an invitation. And this might take time. I'm going to come in here every day and sit here like this. And it's a process. I'm opening up an invitation of, I'm available. And on top of my exposures, I never do. It never turns out great. I'm like, I'm doing a hard thing. And I can sit here without my phone. And I'm like getting confident within myself that I can sit here and be okay with me. And that's really the ultimate goal.
Can both of you talk about it? One of the conversations I had with someone at the conference that had OCD, but they had social anxiety disorder and depression. And they were talking about just how negative and hurtful their inner dialogue is. And I really truly believe whether it's OCD, depression, social anxiety disorder, the goal is to start, that negative voice that, like, as soon as you walk out the door and you go to, like you're saying, Natasha, like you go to an event and your brain is already coming up with all the horrific ways that everybody thinks you're awkward and weird and strange. Obviously, we don't want to, engage in like self-reassurance all the time, but how does somebody get to a point that their internal dialogue starts to be helpful, or at least starts to be neutral versus so negative and hurtful?
Yeah, I think the first step is awareness, because depending on how long you've had social anxiety, it could feel like that's just your voice. Like that's just the truth speaking in your mind. There's no separation. Where I feel like when you have OCD, there's a little bit of like, you're an intruder. Like, why am I having this thought? It's like incongruent. With social anxiety, it feels like completely aligned with who you are and what you believe. And so sometimes just doing an exercise where you write down the thoughts that pop in your head periodically, do like a 48-hour sampling, that can sometimes be shocking. Like, oh my gosh, like that's a lot. Write a transcript. And then would you say that to your friend? Would you say that to your mom? Would you say that to your, closest, best friend? No, like they're horrible, horrible things. And so I think being aware of that, I actually played this game, which would not be good for OCD, where whenever I caught, and personifying social anxiety, I think can be really helpful. Like we personify OCD and anxiety. But whenever I caught my social anxiety, which I call paro for paranoid, which helped separate it out as more, even more so, I would have to like say something back to him. And we don't want to do canceling out thoughts with OCD. But if it was like, oh my gosh, that shirt looks so stupid. And I'd be like, I actually really like this shirt. It's not that bad. And like, I made it a task that I had to kind of respond. And it became tiring. And so I didn't want to have any more paro thoughts, because it was like kind of exhausting to always have to be like, well, and we don't really care if people like us or whatever. So the awareness is really key, I think, to start with.
Yeah. I want to put a comment on, and I'd love to get everybody's opinions. It's from Matthew Bannister at 1219, Rachel. It says, I used to struggle a lot with social anxiety, with shaking in public situations, but it passes in time, either doing value-driven exposures. I'm currently doing exposures with social anxiety, with saying hello or smiling to a stranger while walking past them on the street, as I used to find it awkward in those situations too. So obviously Matthew's talking about some of those exposures we've been talking about. Why do you think that those are working? I mean, we know why it works as clinicians, but people watching, why does it work to really start to put yourself out there and challenge some of those fears?
Yeah, and I'm happy to hop in here a little bit too. And what I want to say is just to remember to both like all of these different models of learning that happen is that, yes, not only are you doing exposures, right? You're facing your fears, but you're also able to start to have new experiences, right? Maybe, as Natasha said, sometimes the experiences might not be amazing, but like you did it, right? It's a new experience. Maybe the experience is, oh, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't as bad as I expected. And maybe the experience is, wow, that was way better than I expected, right? Who knows? It could be both and. And so I think it's just so important to recognize that really, like, we want you to be able to see that fear doesn't have to dictate our life, but that unfortunately when we avoid or we engage in kind of, we like white knuckle our way even through a social exposure, we're going to end up sending the message that it actually makes the anxiety stronger. And so across the board, what can we do that can send a different message to anxiety and then to ourselves? And I think it's really important. I learned this little tool with my kids. I have a 2 and a 3-year-old, but the little tool of like when my kids do something I'm proud of, instead of me saying, I'm so proud of you, I now will say, are you proud of yourself? And they just like beam, you guys. And it's such a so great to see how, and my Olivia will be like, yes, I'm proud of myself. And it's like, awesome. And so and you did it. Are you proud of yourself? And can you see what you did? And can you start to build that muscle and confidence in yourself that in the future, when you're anxious, but you have a social engagement, you're able to say, oh, I know I can do this, even though it'll be hard.
Yeah, I love that.
I love it too, because it's not always the outcome, it's more the effort you put in, because we all know we have put in so much effort in things, right? And sometimes it just doesn't come out the way we want it. Like somebody else beats us in something, or we don't get the job after putting ourselves in it. But if we're focusing more on like what we can do and like, really pushing forward, like you were saying with Olivia, maybe it's not going to go her way this time, but she's going to learn that she can do things and stuff like that. I also like this comment. I'd love to get it. It's kind of what you're talking about earlier, Natasha. It's from Michael LC at 1221. And they say, it's really interesting. Social anxiety is like a specialized obsession around evaluation, and that individual evaluation fear is so unique. So I think what's so hard and what we're talking about, Liz and Natasha, is like, you're kind of the one evaluating your way in a situation, but you have this social anxiety filter. And we were talking about that, Natasha, like it zooms in and tries to come up with evidence that we're doing horribly. So can you, maybe you start, Natasha, and then you could jump in, Liz, about how come evaluating ourselves in social situations when we have social anxiety typically doesn't work out in our favor?
Yeah, well, for starters, our perceptions are skewed. So, and when we're evaluating ourselves actively in a social situation, we're not present. So we're not present in that moment. And so kind of like what you're talking about before, giving off those cues that we're disengaged or we're not interested or we're aloof, that's all happening because I'm sitting there in my head being like, she didn't give me eye contact. She looks like she's bored. She's moving away. And so it's not a clear perception of like what's actually happening. I actually find it's helpful in those moments to work with some mindfulness and training the brain to focus on the now, and refocus your energy on the conversation, which sounds kind of obvious, but when you are having social anxiety, you are 90% in your head when you are actively, spiraling. And so sometimes I'll even focus on like their shirt, or like I'll ground myself on like, oh, like look at their rings and look at their hair. And then I'm like, oh, listen to what they're talking about, and not imagine my own story as they're talking, because sometimes we do that. What am I going to say next? But being really in the moment can help, because you can have a perception after that, and then work with that being an accurate perception.
Very well said. And Liz, the next comment, I like this one. It's from Nathan. It's a two-part comment. So at 12:31, he says, I used to have a hard time navigating social situations, but he says at 12:36, but because of treatment, my attitude has slowly changed for the better. I think one of the things that you talked about when we were all hanging out at the conference is like wanting to put more and more of a message out there that people do get better. So how important is it for Nathan and then other people watching to learn that treatment helps change your perspective on things?
Oh, it's everything. We just started a podcast that we're real excited about called the Anxiety Society. And our like slogan is it's basically like anxiety. And then we say, we all have it, we all contribute to it, and we have the power to change it. And that last piece is the most important, right? It's us recognizing that like, okay, we have OCD, we have anxiety, whatever's going on, we can't change that. And we do have the choice to either empower it and contribute to it, or to totally change our relationship with it. And I think so many of us kind of do that 1 foot in, 1 foot out dance with treatment, right? Of like, I'll like make my way, I'll like white knuckle my way through this, or I'll do some, but not all of it. And so the experience isn't freedom. The experience is like, y'all hear me talk a lot about this, but we learn to function with high levels of anxiety, or we learn to function with social anxiety, or function with OCD. And that's not the goal. The goal is that you get freedom from your social anxiety, from your OCD, from your anxiety as a whole. But it really takes two things. It takes you being able to both change your relation, like the way you change your relationship is also being willing to believe that you can, being willing to know that you can, being willing to learn how to do that across the board, not some of the times or a little bit of the time. And then you slowly get to see that. And I just love hearing that, because I do think that so many times we are sending the wrong message as a community as a whole, or an advocate community. In the past, we would use a lot of language like, this is a chronic debilitating illness that you'll have forever. And it made us believe, myself included, right, that, oh, the best I'll ever get is like functioning while suffering, or I'm always going to struggle, versus being able to recognize like that didn't have to be the case. That didn't have to be the story.
Yeah, very well said. And I even, people need to hear that, because I know in the beginning when I was so lucky, nobody told me what it was, a chronic disorder. So I went through treatment for OCD and BDD and all these things, not knowing it was chronic. And it actually wasn't until the conference the first conference I went after recovery, that I was hearing so many people say it's chronic. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm so happy that I heard that messaging after recovery. So I'm like, we as a community have to really talk about how it can change. I'd love to get your perspective on this, Natasha, having social anxiety. Nathan, once again, says at 12:39, I'm realizing that most people out there in society don't have the negative attitudes that I used to assume they had. So one video I saw actually that I showed my client who has social anxiety that really resonated with her, it was a guy who had social anxiety disorder, and he still does, obviously, but he's doing a lot better. And he said that same thing. He's like, I had to start to realize that that nasty, judgmental, mean, and critical voice inside was a self-owned voice, and that other people don't hold that same voice. And I was just projecting on them, assuming they held the same beliefs. But once I realized it was an internal thing and other people don't have that, it started to make me feel safe around people. So how have you navigated recognizing that people aren't here to kind of judge? Has that helped through treatment?
Yeah, it's very liberating when, and for me, and I feel like for a lot of the people I've worked with, you have to get to the point where you don't care first, so it's this self-love. So much of the treatment was self-focused, self-love, accepting myself. I am enough just the way I am, all that kind of work of like, I believe in myself. And then if you don't believe in me, or if you do have something negative to say, then I don't need that energy, or I don't need that relationship. And so once you accept that, the fear is so much less, because you're like, I can handle rejection because it's not going to completely destroy me. And so, and then you can go out there and I would do exposures where I'd say, okay, you have to say hi to 2 people that you don't know, or you have to start a conversation, sit next to that person, it's like a fully empty place. And there's one person sitting there, go sit next to them instead of picking an empty seat, and just introduce yourself. And there was less risk because I already fully accepted myself. And so if they did, look at me weird and then just kind of move away, or they, the conversation fizzled, I was more able to handle that because of the self-acceptance. But ironically, what I have found is that you open up all these opportunities, that maybe you make contact with 5 people, or you smile to 5 people. And then, 3 of them smile back, 2 won't. And you're like, okay, that was rude, but you're like, whatever. And you want to the next one. And if you don't play that game of the odds, right, that I put myself out there and, a percentage responds back and it feels so great. With social anxiety, you rob yourself of any of those experiences because you don't even put yourself in the game. And so it can be so liberating to feel like the world isn't this like judgmental, horrible, mean place. There's a sprinkle, that's normal, but that there's this opportunity to connect with people on a level that you were robbing yourself of.
Yeah, while you're talking, I always feel like there's such a similarity in the conversations with BDD as well as social anxiety, because my clients with BDD, I'm trying to teach them the same thing, but obviously it's just appearance based. That everybody didn't like. I was looking exhausted at the conference because it's the whole 3-hour difference. So I was like up to like 3 a.m. talking to people because I have so much energy. It's only like 11:45, like back at home or whatever. But then I have to wake up 3 hours later and I was exhausted. And the BDD was like, oh my God, everybody's like, Chris looks so tired. And then I was like, nobody literally like bought a ticket to the conference and was like, I wonder if Chris is going to look tired or his hair isn't going to look great because he didn't get to do it in the morning because he only is like, so it's the same with my clients with social anxiety disorder. It's like all of us believe that there's such such a judgment on us. Like people are walking around with a notepad. Like, I wonder how Natasha is going to interact with that grocery store worker. And when you finally look like nobody really cares, that's such a freedom. Liz, what I wanted to ask you is, you work at a residential, well, you don't work, you run a residential. So you get a lot of people with co-occurring. So can you talk to people watching this that may have OCD and social anxiety disorder? Do they have to see different specialists? Is it something that OCD providers can also work with? And then how can someone get help for both?
Yeah, great question. Most of our patients have comorbid conditions, and so whether that's a comorbid anxiety disorder or something else, depression, et cetera, OCD related disorder, right? We treat it all. They do not have to see a separate specialist. Somebody who specializes in OCD should be able to treat social anxiety, and they should also specialize in social anxiety. So most of us that treat OCD specialize in anxiety and anxiety related disorders. The treatment, of course, looks a little bit different just because the way social anxiety shows up and presents is a little bit different than OCD. A big example is that instead of compulsions, there's a lot of avoidance, right? Avoidance happens in OCD too, but like it looks a little bit different where there may not be as many, or there may be some, but there may not be compulsions at all with social anxiety where there is going to be a lot of avoidance. However, the values-based CBT work at its core works across the board. Now, yes, if you're treating OCD, you need to specifically be doing ERP. If you're treating social anxiety, you're going to be using more CBT and exposure, kind of work. And so it should differentiate, but the work looks very similar. What I will say that I love is that my biggest thing when patients are at our program, and hopefully with any provider that they're working with, is can you generalize what you're learning? I actually don't care. It's great. It's awesome. I'm happy for you. And it should be the case that if you're getting specific treatment, you see great outcomes for those symptoms that you're showing up for. Like, of course, we want that to happen. But I also want to make sure that you're generalizing the treatment. You're able to really understand across the board, oh, this is how people really, like, at the end of the day, this is how people make anxiety bigger, or this is how they decrease it. And I love it when our patients say things like, yeah, I was talking to my mom on the phone last night, and I realized, like, all the ways she's engaging with her own anxiety. And, like, I just wanted to tell her, just change and do these few things and it'll make a big difference. And I love that. That gets me really excited, because that means that you're starting to see treatment outside of just that tunnel vision lens of your current symptoms, and you're starting to generalize it. And this is a really big, important piece of treatment and treatment outcomes, because what we know is that anxiety can kind of latch onto anything, right? It can shift, it can waver, it can move. And we don't want you, whether it's social anxiety or OCD, to say, oh, I don't know how to deal with this because I didn't do this in treatment. Like, you do know how to deal with it, right? The treatment looks very similar. We just need to adapt it.
Well said. I like this comment by Spence Robert. They say personifying or objectifying, externalizing, like Natasha mentioned, is an effective part of my treatment. Chris and Liz have mentioned these techniques over various past streams. So you were talking, Natasha, like naming the social anxiety as para, short for paranoid. It's so funny because when I first, I don't know how for both of you, when I first tell clients over the age of maybe like 12, like, we're going to name it, we're going to externalize it, we might even draw it or talk about it, people are always like, lame alert. And it's always one of the things at the end of treatment, they were like, naming it and externalizing it single-handedly was one of the most effective parts of treatment, because myself and my family started to treat it like an other. It helped with infighting, and it helped me feel like I was challenging something that wasn't with me and my values. So Natasha, can you expand on that? Like, how did you come up with the name? Where did you hear that externalizing was helpful? And talk about what it's like to have that relationship externalizing it.
Yeah, I always did. I always externalized it with kids. It was just something I always did since I started working with kids with anxiety and OCD. It just seemed like an obvious thing to do, to like externalize it, Mr. Worry or Mr. OCD or Mr. O. And I never thought about externalizing my own social anxiety until I really started to do my own work in my 40s. It wasn't until I started to have a platform and I started to have to like speak, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have a problem. Like, and I didn't realize like all the acuity that was actually really obvious now that I look at it. I was debilitated. Like, I couldn't go out and put like Christmas decorations in my front yard because I felt like everyone was staring at me. I couldn't get the mail. I'd have to drive to get the mail, even though it's like in a mailbox just right down the street. But it wasn't until I had to speak. And I'm like, I need to do the same stuff that I'm doing for the kids that I work with. It's not a baby thing. And so I thought, like, what's the crux of my social anxiety? It makes me completely paranoid. I'm like, they're whispering about me. They're talking about me. They're all probably getting together without me. So I abbreviated it and called it Paro. And interestingly, when I did that for myself, like, you can teach this stuff, but when you apply it to yourself, it's so different. It became this thing that I'm really competitive. And so I was like, I don't want Paro to win. And it really spoke to my competitive side, where I was like, Natasha 2.0 is coming back. And she's like, and so I had actually two going on, because Natasha 2.0 was like, you have to go to that. You have to go to the party, or you have to go. And I'm like, stop. She's like, you can do it though. So I had a little cheerleader, but it was like, Paro is like telling me lies. It really was feeding me these lies, and it was making me perceive the world in a way that wasn't accurate. And so it can be incredibly empowering. And then I can address that even with my own kids and my family. I'm sorry, like, Paro's getting in the way right here, and model that for my kids.
Yeah, I relate, because my therapist never had me name the OCD, but they definitely talked about it like that. They said, I played sports and I was competitive, and my therapist, Karen Pickett, she's like, why don't we treat OCD like it's the captain of the other team? And there was this kid named Chris Martin who I was talking on a panel about him, so hopefully he's doing great. But he just happened to be somebody that was always like the captain of teams I played against. And I would picture going home that week between sessions, and it's like either I can come back next week and like Chris Martin and his team has won, or I'm gonna win. So I was like super competitive. So it's great. Liz, Jay Ivy says, just subscribe to the Anxiety Society podcast. So can you talk a little bit about how people can subscribe? And, you and Callie are doing great work with this. And just like, what are some of the things that this audience is going to get from subscribing to that podcast?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. I love to talk about this. So you can find, it's called the Anxiety Society podcast. You can find on Spotify, Apple, kind of all the main platforms. We're working on a YouTube page. We're not there yet, but that way you can see our video and make fun of us and all of our bloopers that happened during. But this has just been such a fun little project. And it is really our way of saying, okay, our goal is that we're going to bring on so many leading clinicians and experts, just like these lunch and learns, but as it'll be another avenue for us to provide free education and support to the community. And for us to kind of say, all right, we all know we have some of these great tools in our head, right? Or that we use every day, but hey, like, let's make sure we give it to the community. So we're really excited. And the big piece here is that at the end of the day, the Anxiety Society podcast is about how we live in an entire society of anxiety and how we can start to shift that and change that and what it'll look like. So we're hoping it will challenge you. It'll be fun. You'll laugh, but that also it'll be informative and educational.
Yeah, Spence Roberts says the Anxiety Society podcasts are great. I've listened to 3 of them. I highly recommend.
Yay, thank you. Thank you. Love y'all.
For you, Natasha, Sharon West at 1247 says, I like the word that everybody's been using, work. It's so much work to take control and we can do it. So can you talk about that? Because I always tell my younger clients, I'm like, treatment is not a, Amazon 2-day delivery. So I think sometimes, other people will push modalities or they'll talk about like, you don't have to be anxious. You don't have to work hard. It's easy. And I think we all want that. I know I do, right? For anything. But talk about like the rewarding aspect of work. So I think people only think of the negative component.
Yeah, it's that repetitiveness, especially with social anxiety, of doing it over and over and over again, where you get desensitized and you're like, I can do this. And there is a lot of reward in the work because you do something hard. And no matter what the result is, you're just like, I can't believe I did that. You eventually get a cheerleader in your head who's like, you crushed that, or like, that was so awkward and you handled that. And so as you're doing the work, you're empowering yourself and you're feeling even better. And your self-love is getting bigger because you are doing really hard things. And for me, I can feel, I had to go to back to school day yesterday. And those are a nightmare for me. And normally when my husband was alive, I'd have him go, or I wouldn't go at all because it's like a sea of PTA ladies and I just can't handle it. And I went yesterday and I asked my 20-year-old, can you come? She's like, I'm not going to do it. I did it last year. And I'm like, fine, I'll do it by myself. And nothing bothered me. And so that's work again, going to something I didn't want to do. And then afterwards I was like, I got in the car and I'm like, I was not anxious one moment. And it's just so rewarding when you are doing the work and you can see the effects while you're doing the work.
Before we do final thoughts, I really want to hear both of your opinion on this because I think it's so important. And I know both of you real well. And I know this is the message we're trying to get out about treatment. At 1254, Spence Roberts says, it keeps the disorders from being conflated with your core being. ERP makes more sense when those two things are separate, adds to clarity. So one of the things that I think that we're always trying to say about ERP is that you do start to learn like who is the core Liz, who is the core Natasha, core Chris, and what is the disorder. And you learn that they're separate and you learn to start to uncover the real you. And I think sometimes people put messaging out there that isn't accurate about that, but I really stand by the treatment because that's what happened with me. Both of you with lived experience, can you talk about how the treatment has actually gotten you closer to discover the real Natasha and the real Liz?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first, but that's exactly what treatment should do, right? Treatment should allow you to no longer have to live by your anxiety or OCD's rules and rigidity and to be able to live by your own, right? What are the things I want to be doing? What are the ways I want to engage with in relationships and with the world? And I want to be able to do that freely without anything else playing a role in what decisions I make. And that's exactly what treatment has done for me and can do for everyone.
Yeah, and I think with social anxiety, it makes you think you are something you're not. And so when you strip social anxiety, you kind of meet yourself for the first time because all of who you thought you were, like so much of it is social anxiety. And you might be, I'm an introvert, And I'm embracing that. I actually don't like to be around people, but it's not because people repel, I repel people. And so you start to craft a story about who you really are. And I do feel like they're very separate. Social anxiety is hard because I feel like it's like this. And so it's like, what do I look like without these fears? What do I look like without this story? And underneath it, it's a whole new person to meet.
Absolutely. Natasha, as we go to final thoughts, I want to give it to you first. I know you mentioned you're writing your memoir. Can you talk a little bit about that, about final thoughts for people watching that are dealing with social anxiety, and then the resources that you provide in general?
Yeah. So my memoir, Out of My Shell, is going to be released in September by Jessica Kingsley Publishers. So it's already on Amazon. You can pre-order it. That's totally nerve-wracking. I do feel like there's always hope. I didn't really start working on my social anxiety, ironically, until my 40s. I'm in my early 50s now, and it's night and day. You don't realize like the bricks you're carrying on your shoulders until you get rid of them. And then you can see life in a whole different way. And so doing the work, doing those exposures, doing the reframing in your thinking is incredibly powerful at any age. And for those of you that are parents, I do provide a lot of online resources. And so you can always go to atparentingsurvival.com to check out all that stuff.
I love that. Chris, I want to hear from you about what your thoughts are and share a little bit about how your treatment did it allow you to know yourself more and where you're at today, but also what do you see with your patients?
Yeah, I'll start with the patients with social anxiety because that's the one thing I felt like I collected everything like Pokemon except social anxiety. But what I want to say, and there was a comment by Jay Ivy's thoughts about, I've done a lot more socially, but I've never gotten past the point of panic. Always remember the outcomes of therapy is sort of to be aligned with your values. The goal of social anxiety treatment is not to make you like the center of attention if that's not what you want or your goals. It's really to identify in treatment what are your goals and what do you want. But what I really want to see clients with social anxiety and the ones that go through treatment, I want you to be able to engage with friends, to make connections. I think human connection is such an important part of our wellness. I always feel like isolation is really an outcome of most mental health conditions, and it adds to the loneliness, isolation, and sadness. So what I see with patients is people that come in and they do go to their prom, they do go to that birthday party they're invited to. The person does get that job they like, even though that there's some parts of it that are outgoing. People date, people connect, people become parents. I'll say for me, the reason the treatment was such a connection to myself is I had harm thoughts. I had sexual intrusive thoughts and I had physical harm thoughts. And having those really took a toll on my identity. I started to think that I was a dangerous person. I started to think that I was a horrific person and somebody that people shouldn't trust to be around. I always talk about my Greek side, but I remember reading about my Norwegian side and Vikings had anger. And so I really internalized that. I'm like, oh my God, it's biology. See, I'm going to snap and I'm going to harm people. But treatment really helped me get to the core of who I am. And I learned wait a second, I'm quite the opposite. I'm usually somebody that wants to jump in and protect people. So it made OCD's kind of dialogue seem weaker and weaker. And then lastly, with body dysmorphic disorder, I was able to go to the conference this weekend and talk to people and engage in people, even though I felt that I looked a certain way, but I recognized nobody really cared, only I do. So I think that what treatment can do for everybody watching this stream is there is so many things put on us and it has us start to question our own identity, but treatment really gets you reconnected with who you are, not only internally, but to live that lifestyle that you've always dreamed of. So I hope everybody watching this is looking for resources. And that's why I'm glad everybody comes back. How about for you, Liz? Final thoughts for our viewing audience.
Yeah, I love it. I love everything today. And just remember that freedom is possible. And it's just so important for us to know that our illness doesn't have to define us or any decisions we make. And sometimes those things we feel anxious about or worried about, we actually really surprise ourselves on our ability and we get to build our confidence.
Yeah, I'll say to take us out, please subscribe to Anxiety Society. It's Callie Warner and it's Liz McIngvale. I just did the first BDD podcast on the OCD stories with Stuart Ralph.
Hey!
Yes, I love putting that out there. And then, of course, Natasha Daniels has a book that you can subscribe to. And then please keep joining us. Liz and I will be back next week. And we always enjoy the live streams. And I was telling you before you came on, Liz, so many people came up to me and said how much these mean to them. So thank you to the IOCDF staff and to Liz for bringing this. And Natasha, thank you for hanging out with us. You were such a great guest to have back from the conference. So we loved having you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.